Good evening. This evening I'm reading from Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by Dr. C.G. Jung. And I'm reading Chapter 8, The Historical Significance of the Fish. Now, remember Dr. Jung is talking about how psychologically symbols have been passed along down through the centuries by men of all kinds, men and women. And in the previous two chapters, he was talking about astrology and the fish symbol. And then he was talking about how Nostradamus got his predictions from astrology. So in this chapter, we're talking about how the symbol of the fishes got passed along. Now, let me just get set up. This is a behind-the-scenes reading, so what you see is what you get. I'm sorry. I do stop and do retakes where my tongue bobbles the words. Dr. Jung's writing is very complicated. It includes many foreign words, and so sometimes I get tongue-tied. So, Chapter 8, The Historical Significance of the Fish. In addition to the Pisciculi Christianorum, the Christian fish, the shepherd and the lamb play, as we know only too well, an almost greater role in Christian allegory, and Hermes Creophorus, the ram-bearer, became the prototype for the Good Shepherd, the tutelary god of flocks. Another prototype, in his capacity as shepherd, was Orpheus. This aspect of the poimen gave rise to a figure of similar name in the mystery cults, who was popularized in The Shepherd of Hermas from the 2nd century. Like the giant fish mentioned in the Abersarius inscription, the shepherd probably has connections with Attis, both temporally and regionally. Reisenstein even conjectures that the shepherd of Hermas derives from the Poimandrous writings, which are of purely pagan origin. Shepherd, ram, and lamb symbolism coincides with the expiring Aeon of Aries. In the 1st century of our era, the two eons overlap, and the two most important mystery gods of this period, Attis and Christ, are both characterized as shepherds, rams, and fishes. The Poimen symbolism has undergone such thorough elaboration in the hands of Reisenstein that I am in no position to add anything illuminating in this respect. The case is somewhat different with the fish symbol. Not only are the sources more copious, but the very nature of the symbol, and in particular its dual aspects, give rise to definite psychological questions which I should like to go into more closely. And I think I will put up on the screen so that you can see the image here. Okay, so this is going to be the constellation as soon as I give it to you. Okay, so that's the constellation of Pisces, which is the Aeon in which we're now living near the end of. Paragraph 163. Like every hero, Christ had a childhood that was threatened. Massacre of the innocents, flight into Egypt. The astrological interpretation of this can be found in Revelation 12:1. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She is in the pangs of birth and is pursued by a dragon. She will give birth to a man-child who shall rule the nations with a rod of iron. This story carries echoes of numerous kindred motifs in East and West. For instance, that of Leto and Python, of Aphrodite and her son, who, when pursued, leapt into the Euphrates and were changed into fishes, and to Isis and Horus in Egypt. The Syrian Greeks identified Derceto Atargatis and the Syrian Greeks identified Derceto Atargatis and her son Ichthys with the constellation of the fishes. Paragraph 164. The mother goddess and the star-crowned woman of the apocalypse counts as one, is usually thought of as a virgin. The Christmas message, the Christmas message the virgin has brought forth, the light increases, is pagan. Speaking of the so-called Corian in Alexandria, Epiphanius says that on the night of the Epiphany, January 5th, 6th, the pagans held a great festival. Quote, they stay up the whole night singing songs and playing the flute, offering these to the images of the gods, and when the revelries of the night are over, after cockcrow, they go down with torches into a subterranean sanctuary and bring up a carved wooden image which is laid naked on a litter. On its forehead it has the sign of the cross in gold, and on both its hands 2 other signs of the same shape, and 2 more on its knees, and the 5 signs are all fashioned in gold. They carry this carved image 7 times round the middle of the temple precincts, to the sound of flutes and tambourines and hymns, and after the procession, they carry it down again into the crypt. But if you ask them what this mysterious performance means, they answer, today at this hour, the Kore, that is to say the Virgin, has given birth to the Aeon. Unquote. Paragraph 165. Epiphanius expressly states that he is not telling this of a Christian sect, but of the worshippers of idols, and he does so in order to illustrate the idea that even the pagans bear involuntary witness to the truth of Christianity. Welcome. This is a behind-the-scenes reading of Chapter 8 of Aion. Paragraph 166. Virgo. The zodiacal sign carries either a wheat sheaf or a child. Some authorities connect her with the woman of the apocalypse. At any rate, this woman has something to do with the prophecy of the birth of a Messiah at the end of time. Since the author of the apocalypse was supposed to be a Christian, the question arises, to whom does the woman refer who is interpreted as the mother of the Messiah or of Christ? And to whom does the son of the woman refer, translating the Greek literally, shall pasture the pagans with an iron staff? Question. Shall pasture the pagans with an iron staff. Paragraph 167. As this passage contains an allusion, on the one hand, to the messianic prophecy in Isaiah 66:7, and on the other to Yahweh's wrath, Psalm 2:9, it would seem to refer in some way to the future rebirth of the Messiah. But such an idea is quite impossible in the Christian sphere. Bull says of the description of the Lamb in Revelation 5:6 and following, quote, quote, "This remarkably bizarre figure with 7 horns and 7 eyes cannot possibly be explained in Christian terms. Also, the Lamb develops some very unexpected peculiarities. He is a bellicose lamb, a conqueror, Revelation 17:14. The mighty ones of the earth will have to hide from his wrath, Revelation 6:15 and following. He is likened to the lion of the tribe of Judah, Revelation 5:5. This lamb who is reminiscent of Psalm 2:9, quote, "Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's wheel," unquote, rather gives one the sinister impression of a demonic ram, and not at all of the lamb who is led meekly to the slaughter. The lamb of the apocalypse belongs, without doubt, to the category of horned monsters mentioned in these prophecies. One must therefore consider the question whether the author of the apocalypse was influenced by an idea that was in some sense antithetical to Christ, perhaps by a psychological shadow figure. An umbra Jesu, which was united at the end of time with the triumphant Christ through an act of rebirth. This hypothesis would explain the repetition of the birth myth, and also the curious fact that so important an eschatological expectation as the coming of the Antichrist receives but scant mention in the apocalypse. The 7-horned ram is just about everything that Jesus appears not to be. He is a real shadow figure, but he could not be described as the Antichrist, who is a creature of Satan. For although the monstrous, warlike lamb is a shadow figure in the sense that he is the counterpart of the lamb who was sacrificed, he is not nearly so irreconcilable with Christ as the Antichrist would have to be. The duplication of the Christ figure cannot therefore be traced back to this split between Christ and Antichrist, but is due rather to the anti-Roman resentment felt by the Jewish Christians, who fell back on their God of vengeance and his warlike Messiah. The author of the apocalypse may have been acquainted with Jewish speculations known to us through later tradition. We are told in the Bereshith Rabbati of Moses, Ha-Darsham, that Elias found in Bethlehem a young woman sitting before her door with a newborn child lying on the ground beside her, flecked with blood. She explained that her son had been born at an evil hour, just when the temple was destroyed. Elias admonished her to look after the child. When he came back again 5 weeks later, he asked about her son. He neither walks nor sees nor speaks nor hears, but lies there like a stone, said the woman. Suddenly a wind blew from the four corners of the earth, bore the child away, and plunged him into the sea. Elias lamented that it was now all up to the salvation. Elias lamented that it was now all up with the salvation of Israel. But a Bath call, a voice, said to him, quote, "It is not so. He will remain in the great sea for 400 years, and 80 years in the rising smoke of the children of Korah, 80 years under the gates of Rome, and the rest of the time he will wander round in the great cities until the end of days comes." Paragraph 168. This story describes a Messiah who, though born in Bethlehem, is wafted by divine intervention into the beyond. C equals unconscious. From the very beginning, his childhood is so threatened that he is scarcely able to live. The legend is symptomatic of an extraordinary weakness of the messianic. The legend is symptomatic of an extraordinary weakness of the messianic element in Judaism and the dangers attending it, which would explain the delay in the Messiah's appearance. For 560 years he remains latent, and only then does his missionary work begin. This interlude is not so far off the 530 years mentioned in the Talmudic prophecy, paragraph 133. Near enough anyway for us to compare them, if we take this legend as referring to Christ. In the limitless sea of Jewish speculation, mutual contacts of this sort are more likely to have occurred than not. Thus, the deadly threat to the Messiah and his death by violence is a motif that repeats itself in other stories too. The later, mainly Kabbalistic tradition speaks of two messiahs, the Messiah ben Joseph or ben Ephraim, and the Messiah ben David. Then they were compared to Moses and Aaron, also to two rows, and this on the authority of the Song of Solomon 4:5. Thy two breasts are like two young roes that are twins. Messiah ben Joseph is, according to Deuteronomy 33:17, the firstling of his bullock, and Messiah ben David rides on an ass. Messiah ben Joseph is the first, Messiah ben David the second. Messiah ben Joseph must die in order to atone with his blood for the children of Yahweh. He will fall in the fight against Gog and Magog, and Armilus will kill him. Armilus is the anti-Messiah, whom Satan begot on a block of marble. He will be killed by Messiah ben David in his turn. Afterwards, ben David will fetch the new Jerusalem down from heaven and bring ben Joseph back to life. This ben Joseph plays a strange role in later tradition. Tabari, the commentator on the Quran, mentions that the Antichrist will be a king of the Jews, and in Abarbanel's Mashmi'a Yeshua, the Messiah ben Joseph actually is the Antichrist. So he is not only characterized as the suffering Messiah, in contrast to the victorious one, but is ultimately thought of as his antagonist. This is a sound check. Okay. Sound seems to be still tied up. Welcome to this reading. This is a behind-the-scenes reading of Chapter 8 of Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. I hope everyone is hearing fine. You're welcome to make any comments or questions in the chat. Paragraph 169. As these traditions show, the above-mentioned weakness of the messianic element consists in a split, which in the end becomes a complete polarity. This development is foreshadowed in Persian religious literature, in the pre-Christian idea of an enantiodromia of the great time periods and the deterioration of goodness. The Bamanyas calls the Fourth Iron Age the evil sovereignty of the demons with disheveled hair of the race of wrath. On the other hand, the splitting of the Messiah into two is an expression of an inner disquiet with regard to the character of Yahweh, whose injustice and unreliability must have shocked every thoughtful believer ever since the time of Job. Job puts the problem in unequivocal terms, and Christianity gave an equally unequivocal answer. Jewish mysticism, on the other hand, went its own way, and its speculations hover over depths which Christian thinkers have done their utmost to cover up. I do not want to elaborate this theme here, but will mention as an example a story told by Ibn Ezra. In Spain, he says, there was a great sage who was reputed to be unable to read the 89th Psalm because it saddened him too much. The verses in question are, quote, I will not remove from him my steadfast love or be false to my faithfulness. I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips. Once for all I have sworn my holiness. I will not lie to David. His line shall endure forever, his throne as long as the sun before me. Like the moon it shall be established forever. The witness in the skies is sure, Selah. But now thou hast cast off and rejected. Thou art full of wrath against thy anointed. Thou hast renounced the covenant with thy servant. Thou hast trodden his crown in the dust. Thou hast breached all his walls. Thou hast laid his strongholds in ruins. Nice guy. That comes from Psalm 89, 33 and following. Paragraph 170. Paragraph 170. It is the same problem as in Job. As the highest value and supreme dominant in the psychic hierarchy, the God image is immediately related to, or identical with, the self, and everything that happens to the God image has an effect on the latter. Any uncertainty about the God image causes a profound uneasiness in the self, for which reason the question is generally ignored because of its painfulness. But that does not mean that it remains unasked in the unconscious. What is more, it is answered by views and beliefs like materialism, atheism, and similar substitutes, which spread like epidemics. They crop up wherever and whenever one waits in vain for the legitimate answer. The ersatz product represses the real question into the unconscious and destroys the continuity of historical tradition, which is the hallmark of civilization. The result is bewilderment and confusion. Christianity has insisted on God's goodness as a loving Father and has done its best to rob evil of substance, but the early Christian prophecy concerning the Antichrist and certain ideas in late Jewish theology could have suggested to us that the Christian answer to the problem of Job omits to mention the corollary, the sinister reality of which is now being demonstrated before our eyes by the splitting of the world. The destruction of the God image is followed by the annulment of the human personality. Materialistic atheism with its utopian chimeras forms the religion of all those rationalistic movements which delegate the freedom of personality to the masses and thereby extinguishes it. The advocates of Christianity squander their energies in the mere preservation of what has come down to them, with no thought of building on their house and making it roomier. Stagnation in these matters is threatened in the long run with a lethal end. Paragraph 171. Paragraph 171. As Bousset has plausibly suggested, the duality of the apocalyptic Christ is the outcome of the Jewish Gnostic speculations, whose echoes we hear in the traditions mentioned above. The intensive preoccupation of the Gnostics with the problem of evil stands out in startling contrast to the peremptory nullification of it by the Church Fathers, and shows that this question had already become topical at the beginning of the 3rd century. In this connection, we may recall the view expressed by Valentinus that Christ was born not without a kind of shadow, and that he afterwards cast off the shadow from himself. Valentinus lived sometime in the first half of the 2nd century, and the Apocalypse was probably written about AD 90 under Domitian. Like other Gnostics, Valentinus carried this gospel a stage further in his thinking, and for this reason it does not seem to me impossible that he understood the shadow as the Yahwistic law under which Christ was born. The Apocalypse and other things in the New Testament could easily have prompted him to such a view, quite apart from the more or less contemporaneous ideas about the demiurge and the prime ogdode that consists of light and shadow. It is not certain whether Origen's doubt concerning the ultimate fate of the devil was original. At all events, it proves that the possibility of the devil's reunion with God was an object of discussion in very early times, and indeed had to be if Christian philosophy was not to end in dualism. One should not forget that the theory of the privatio boni does not dispose of the eternity of hell and damnation. God's humanity is also an expression of dualism, as the controversy of the Monophysites and Diopnosites in the early church shows. Apart from the religious significance of the decision in favor of a complete union of both natures, I would mention in passing that the Monophysite dogma was a noteworthy psychological aspect. It tells us, in psychological parlance, that since Christ as a man corresponds to the ego and as God to the self, He is at once both ego and self, part and whole. Empirically speaking, consciousness can never comprehend the whole. Consciousness can never comprehend the whole, but it is probable that the whole is unconsciously present in the ego. This would be equivalent to the highest possible state of completeness or perfection. Now, of course, what I just read is very significant in Dr. Jung's psychology. So I'm going to just read that last sentence, or that last little bit. Okay. Apart from the religious significance of the decision in favor of a complete union of both natures, I would mention in passing that the Monophysite dogma has a noteworthy psychological aspect. It tells us in psychological parlance that since Christ as a man corresponds to the ego and as God to the self, he is at once both ego and self, part and whole. Empirically speaking, consciousness can never comprehend the whole, but it is probable that the whole is unconsciously present in the ego. This would be equivalent to the highest possible state, completeness, or perfection. Okay, so this is the conjunctio that Dr. Jung talked about. Let's see what comments we have here. Okay, I'm glad everyone is hearing well right now. Let me just do one more sound check. Okay, seems okay. Keeping going. Paragraph 172. I have dwelt at some length on the dualistic aspects of the Christ figure because, through the fish symbolism, Christ was assimilated into a world of ideas that seems far removed from the Gospels, a world of pagan origin, saturated with astrological beliefs to an extent that we can scarcely imagine today. Christ was born at the beginning of the Aeon of the fishes. It is by no means ruled out that there were educated Christians who knew of the It is by no means ruled out that there were educated Christians who knew of the conjunctio maxima of Jupiter and Saturn in Pisces in the year 7 BC, just as, according to the Gospel reports, there were Chaldeans who actually found Christ's birthplace. The fishes, however, are a double sign. Paragraph 173. At midnight on Christmas Eve, when, according to the old-time reckoning, the sun enters Capricorn, Virgo is standing on the eastern horizon and is soon followed by the serpent held by Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. This astrological coincidence seems to me worth mentioning, as also the view that the two fishes are mother and son. The latter idea has quite a special significance because this relationship suggests that the two fishes were originally one. In fact, Babylonian and Indian astrology know of only one fish. Later, this mother evidently gave birth to a son who was a fish like her. The same thing happened to the Phoenician Directo Atargatis, who, half fish herself, had a son Ichthus. It is just possible that the sign of the prophet Jonah goes back to an older tradition about an heroic knight sieger. Goes back... It is just possible that the sign of the prophet Jonah goes back to an older tradition about an heroic night sea journey and the conquest of death, where the hero is swallowed by a fish, whale dragon, and is then reborn. The redemption name Yeshua, Yeshua, in Greek Iosus, is connected with the fish. Joshua is the son of Nun. Joshua is the son of Nun, and Nun means fish. The Joshua ben Nun of the Kidder legend had dealings with a fish that was meant to be eaten, but was revived by a drop of water from the fountain of life. Now, this reference to the Kidder legend refers to Surah 18 of the Quran and was raised heavily by Dr. Edinger in his lecture Encounters with the Greater Personality. So you can find this Kidder legend in Surah 18 of the Quran. Paragraph 174. The mythological great mothers are usually a danger to their sons. Jeremiah's mentions a fish representation on an early Christian lamp, showing one fish devouring the other. The name of the largest star in the constellation, known as the Southern Fish, Fomalhaut, the fish's mouth, might be interpreted in this sense, just as in fish symbolism, every conceivable form of devouring concupiscentia. Every conceivable form of devouring concupiscentia is attributed to fishes, which are said to be ambitious, libidinous, voracious, avaricious, lascivious. In short, an emblem of the vanity of the world and of earthly pleasures, voluptas tyranna. They owe these bad qualities most of all to their relationship with the mother and love goddess Ishtar, Astarte, Atargatus, and Aphrodite. As the planet Venus, she has her exaltatio in the zodiacal sign of the fishes. Thus, in astrological tradition, as well as in the history of symbols, the fishes have always had this these opprobrious. The fishes have sorry. I'm sorry, Jonathan. I'm not sure what you're referring to for the spelling. But anyway, in terms of the word I'm currently trying to pronounce, I'll put that one in the chat here. If I can find it again. Opprobrious. Okay, that's the word. Don't mind me. Going back, the fishes have always had these opprobrious qualities attached to them, while on the other hand laying claim to a special and higher significance. This claim is based, at least in astrology, on the fact that anyone born under Pisces may expect to become a fisherman or a sailor, and in that capacity to catch fishes or hold dominion over the sea, an echo of the primitive totemistic identity between the hunter and his prey. The Babylonian culture hero Oannes was himself a fish, and the Christian Ictus is a fisher of men par excellence. Symbologically, he sorry, I need to correct this for a moment. Okay, going back. Symbologically, he is actually the hook or bait on God's fishing rod with which the Leviathan, death, or the devil is caught. In Jewish tradition, the Leviathan is a sort of Eucharistic food stored up for the faithful in paradise. After death, they clothe themselves in fish robes. Christ is not only a fisher, but the fish that is Eucharistically eaten. Augustine says in his Confessions, quote, "But the earth eats the fish that was drawn from the deep at the table which you have prepared for them that believe. At the table which you have prepared for them that believe, for the fish was drawn from the deep in order to nourish the needy ones of the earth," unquote. St. Augustine is referring to the meal of fishes eaten by the disciples at Emmaus, Luke 24:43. We come across the healing fish in the story of Tobit. The angel Raphael helps Tobit to catch the fish that is about to eat him, and shows him how to make a magic smoke against evil spirits from the heart and liver of the fish, and how he can heal his father's blindness with its gall. Tobit 6:1 and following. Paragraph 175. St. Peter Damian, died 1072, describes monks as fishes, because all pious men are little fishes leaping in the net of the great fisher. In the Pectorius inscription, beginning of the 4th century, believers are called the divine descendants of the heavenly fish. The fish of Manu. Paragraph 176. The fish of Manu is a savior, identified in legend with Vishnu, who had assumed the form of a small goldfish. He begs Manu to take him home because he was afraid of being devoured by the water monsters. He then grows mightily, fairy tale fashion, and in the end rescues Manu from the great flood. On the 12th day of the first month of the Indian year, a golden fish is placed in a bowl of water and invoked as follows, quote, "As thou, O God, in the form of a fish, hast saved the Vedas that were in the underworld, so save me also, O Keshava," unquote. De gubernatus I'm going to put this in the chat. It's de gubernatus, I think, but so de gubernatus, yeah, de gubernatus. De Gubernatus and other investigators after him tried to derive Christian fish from India. Indian influence is not impossible, since relations with India existed even before Christ, and various spiritual currents from the East made themselves felt in early Christianity, as we know from the reports of Hippolytus and Epiphanius. Nevertheless, there is no serious reason to derive the fish from India, for Western fish symbolism is so rich and at the same time so archaic that we may safely regard it as as autochthonous. We may safely regard it as autochthonous. Paragraph 177. Since the fishes stand for mother and son, the mythological tragedy of the son's early death and resurrection is already implicit in them. Being the 12th sign of the Zodiac, Pisces denotes the end of the astrological year and also a new beginning. This characteristic coincides with the claim of Christianity to be the beginning and end of all things, and with its eschatological expectation of the end of the world and the coming of God's kingdom. Thus, the astrological characteristics of the fish contain essential components of the Christian myth. First, the cross. Second, the moral conflict and its splitting into the figures of Christ and Antichrist. Third, the motif of the son of the Virgin. Fourth, the classical mother-son tragedy. Fifth, the danger at birth. And sixth, the savior and bringer of healing. It is therefore not beside the point to relate the designation of Christ as a fish to the new Aeon then dawning. If this relationship existed even in antiquity, it must obviously have been a tacit assumption, or one that was purposely kept secret. For to my knowledge, there is no evidence in the old literature that the Christian fish symbolism was derived from the zodiac. Moreover, the astrological evidence up to the 2nd century A.D. is by no means of such a kind that the Christ-Antichrist antithesis could be derived causally from the polarity of the fishes, since this, as the material we have cited shows, was not stressed as in any way significant. Finally, as Dulger rightly emphasizes, the ichthys was always thought of as only one fish, though here we must point out that in the astrological interpretation, Christ is in fact only one of the fishes, the role of the other fish being allotted to the Antichrist. There are, in short, no grounds whatever for supposing that the zodion of the fishes could have served as the ichthys prototype. 2 more pages. We're doing well. Paragraph 178. Pagan fish symbolism plays in comparison a far greater role. The most important is the Jewish material collected by Schleftelowitz. The Jewish chalice of benediction was sometimes decorated with pictures of fishes, for fishes were the food of the blessed in paradise. The chalice was placed in the dead man's grave as a funerary. The chalice was placed in the dead man's grave as a funerary gift. Fishes have a wide distribution as sepulchre symbols. The Christian fish occurs mainly in this connection. Devout Israelites who live in the water of the doctrine are likened to fishes. This analogy was self-evident around AD 100. The fish also has a messianic significance. According to the Syrian apocalypse of Baruch, Leviathan shall rise from the sea with the advent of the Messiah. This is probably the very great fish of the Albercius inscription, corresponding to the fish from the fountain mentioned in a religious debate at the court of the Sassanids, 5th century. The fountain refers to the Babylonian Hera, but in Christian language it means Mary, who in Orthodox as well as Gnostic circles, Acts of Thomas, was invoked as fountain. Thus we read in a hymn of Synesius, parentheses, fountain of fountains, source of sources, root of roots, monad of monads art thou, close parentheses. The fountain of Hera was also said to contain the one fish that is caught by the hook of divinity and feeds the whole world with its flesh. In the Boeotian vase painting, the Lady of the Beasts is shown with a fish between her legs or in her body, presumably indicating that the fish is her son. Although in the Sassanid debate, the legend of Mary was transferred to Hera, the one fish that is hooked does not correspond to the Christian symbol. For in Christian symbology, the crucifix is the hook or bait with which God catches Leviathan, who is either death or the devil, the ancient serpent, but not the Messiah. In Jewish tradition, on the other hand, the pharmakon Athanasius is the flesh of Leviathan, and the messianic fish, as Sheftelovich says. The Talmud Sanhedrin says that the Messiah will not come until a fish is sought for an invalid, and cannot be procured. According to the Apocalypse of Baruch, Behemoth, as well as Leviathan, is a Eucharistic food. This is assiduously overlooked. As I have explained elsewhere, Yahweh's two prehistoric monsters seem to represent a pair of opposites, the one being unquestionably a land animal and the other aquatic. Paragraph 179. Since olden times, not only among the Jews but all over the Near East, the birth of an outstanding human being has been identified with the rising of a star. Thus Balaam prophesies in Numbers 24:17, quote, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. A star shall come forth out of Jacob, unquote. Paragraph 180. Always the hope of a Messiah is connected with the appearance of a star. According to the Zohar, the fish that swallowed Jonah died, but revived after 3 days and then spewed him out again. Through the fish we shall find a medicament for the whole world. This text is medieval, but comes from a trustworthy source. The very great and pure fish from the fountain mentioned in the Abercius inscription is, in the opinion of Sheftelovich, none other than Leviathan, which is not only the biggest fish, but is held to be pure, as Sheftelovich shows by citing the relevant passages from Talmudic literature. In this connection, we might also mention the one and only fish recorded in the happenings of Persia. Okay. I guess that's got it. So that was chapter 8 of Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. And I hope, yep, sounds still good. So, Mean Joe Hicks, Aion sounds a lot like a very Buddhist Eastern interpretation of Christianity and astrology, bit of a union between East and West. Yes, I agree, that's undoubtedly true, especially when we have the references to the Vedas and to the Quran. And Grenade says, what does Jung mean with this quaternity and the Christian cross? Well, the quaternity refers to a Christian mandala, and mandalas can either be circles, or they can be crosses, or they can be squares, and taking up the mandala is an entirely different issue than tonight. There's one long article by Dr. Jung about the mandala, and he mentions it very often. Keep in mind that what we're talking here about is symbols of the self, and I thought it was pretty amazing, actually, when Dr. Jung earlier in this talks about an early writer who talked about the ego and the self, because this is exactly what Dr. Jung was talking about in the 20th century. Right. Here is, this is in paragraph 171, toward the end. Apart from the religious significance of the decision in favor of a complete union of both natures, I would mention in passing that the Monophysite dogma was a noteworthy psychological aspect, has a noteworthy psychological aspect. It tells us in psychological parlance that since Christ as a man corresponds to the ego and as God to the self, he is at once both ego and self, part and whole. Empirically speaking, consciousness can never comprehend the whole, but it is probable that the whole is unconsciously present in the ego. This would be equivalent to the highest possible state of completeness and perfection. And those couple of sentences really sum up a central tenet of Jungian psychology, which is that we have this scale with the ego, with the ego on one hand, the ego on one end and the self on the other end. And we've talked a lot about the ego-self axis, so I'm not going to bring that up here. It's my picture of mandala. I'm not sure what picture you're referring to. And Julie Moses. And I'm only not saying your name because I can't pronounce a name that's essentially all consonants, but Julie Ma says, so synchronistic that I just found your channel a day ago and had decided to try and read Aion again. And so Julie, as of now, I began reading Aion a year ago, believe it or not, and so far I've gotten up through chapter 8 tonight, and I've also read in conjunction with the reading of Aion, Dr. Edward Edinger's The Aion Lectures, which explains much of this. So that I have not read tonight because it took an hour to read chapter 8. And also, just for your information, in the advanced reading group, we are running a seminar on Aion, and chapter 8 is the topic for Wednesday at 1:30. And all the previous sessions in the advanced group are in video form, but they're not on the YouTube channel. They're in a private Dropbox for the advanced group. If you're interested in that, please send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com and we'll talk. Mr. Caleb NM8 says, so Leviathan and Ichthys are both symbols of the self. I don't think that's right. I think that Ichthys is a symbol of the self, and Leviathan was a symbol of the dragon or evil. And you can go back. There's 2 videos that I did where I read Edward Edinger's Encounters with the Self, which goes on the YouTube channel under the name Edinger's Portable Analytic Hour. The 2 videos together amount to 1 hour and 15 minutes. It's a very short book, but in that reading, especially in, I think, the second one, you'll find William Blake's image of Yahweh pointing down at Leviathan. Leviathan and Behemoth are intended to be the meal of the celebratory meal at the end of the world, I guess, according to Yahweh. But anyway, so they're not both symbols of the self. I think only Ichthys is. And since Ichthys came up in Persian culture also, let's not conflate them, because even in this reading we were talking about Ichthys, but that was the Persian Ichthys, not the Ichthys that became the symbol of Christ. The symbol next to your name, tiny picture. Let's see. Well, I'm sorry to say I can't see it very clearly, but yes, that tiny picture certainly would be a mandala. Julie Moss says, I totally understand. The Grenade says, Jung is a lot to take in. Almost could read it for years and still learn new things. Well, that's definitely true, since I've been at it for 31 years now, and I can assure you that I'm nowhere near fully conversant with all the ideas that he was presenting, not even close. And so Julie said, okay, good to know, thanks. Oh, I love the Blake pictures. So anyway, William Blake's book, Encounter with the Self, which you can certainly get from the Jung Library or the Jung bookstore at the Jung Society of LA, if nowhere else, but I think it's now back in print even on Amazon. But anyway, that book is an explanation of Blake's pictures by Edward Edinger, but he calls it his Portable Analytic Hour. And so you need to refer to those 2 videos that I did, in which all the pictures are presented and the reading of Edinger's points are done. That's called Edinger's Portable Analytic Hour, part 1 and part 2, and you can see all of it and see how he put it all together. And so, okay, so it's Sunday evening, and I'm going to move back on to my own life, and I will see you tomorrow at the weekly meeting of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group, at which we will be reading from the book Dreams by C.G. Jung, which is a compendium of 5 essays that Dr. Jung wrote about dreams during his lifetime. And I will try to get through the first and second essays tomorrow in our discussion. So at popular request, we're going to cover dreams. I am not a mental health professional, so I will not be interpreting anybody else's dreams or any of your dreams. I may interpret some of my own dreams, and I may refer to some of the dreams that Dr. Jung talks about in his book, but I'm not going to interpret anybody's dreams other than to just give you a direction. Do not go out and buy a dream book or a dream symbols book. I have one right here, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow. And it's the Book of Symbols. It's a tome. It makes a very good doorstop, but it is, how can I say this? It won't help you very much in interpreting your dreams, and I'll explain why that's true tomorrow. But anyway, so thank you all for joining tonight, and I will see you tomorrow, I hope, at the 95th session of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. Will be conducted tomorrow evening from 8 to 10 U.S. Eastern Time, tomorrow Monday, which is our regular time for the discussion. So thank you for joining me this evening.